Good morning, everyone. So as most of you know, I've spent much of the last week wandering around school, telling everybody it's November and it's not Christmas and we're not doing Christmas yet, but it's not anymore. It's December, so I need to move with everyone and admit that it is now Christmas time and do a Christmas assembly. So I'm going to do an assembly that's really, it's a poem. It's a poem that my dad read to me when I was little, and he explained it because it was quite difficult to understand. It's written by a very famous poet, and I'm going to explain the story behind the poem to begin with, and then hopefully you'll understand all the words in the poem when I read it at the end. So here we go, a little bit of an introduction to King John's Christmas. The poem that I want to read to you was written by a man called A. Milne, who's very famous, particularly for one character that he created that I'll show you in a minute. And he's been dead quite a long time. He died in 1959, so he died even before I was born. So here is a picture of A. Milne's most famous character, or the two most famous characters. Do you know who this is? You might recognise him better from this picture, because this is what they looked like once Walt Disney got involved. Of course, it's Piglet and, more famously, Winnie the Pooh. But the poem that I'm going to tell you about isn't written about Winnie the Pooh. The poem is about King John, who was King of England about 800 years ago, who wasn't a very popular king and wasn't a very nice man. Now we think he looked like this, although Walt Disney says he looks like this. So the poem starts off by explaining that King John wasn't a particularly nice person and nobody liked him and he didn't have any friends, and wherever he went no one spoke to him because they were either afraid of him or they were upset that he might put them in prison, or in those days you could still chop off people's heads if you were the king. So the poem talks about him having to wander around town on his own, and it says people walked past him without taking any notice of him, and they gave him a supercilious stare, which means they would just look at him just a little bit and then walk away because they thought that they were better than King John because he was such a nasty, useless king. And King John would just stand there without speaking, and it says, stood dumbly there, and he'd go red and look embarrassed. And the poem goes on, and it talks about King John having no friends, and he couldn't go out. He had to stay in every afternoon because no one came to see him. No one came to come round to have a cup of tea. And in December, when it was Christmas time and everybody had Christmas cards, and it says wishing you Christmas cheer and fortune, that means good luck, and it says fortune for the coming year. And these cards were never from his near and dear. They weren't from people who loved him and his friends and family. The cards on his shelf were sent by him because he hadn't got anybody else to send him one. Very sad. But he didn't get presents. It says he lived his life aloof, which means he lived on his own. And then he wrote out a message asking for a present and climbed up onto the roof and put it against the chimney, saying to all and sundry, which means to everybody near and far, and then F Christmas in particular, which is obviously Santa. And he didn't sign it Johannes Ra, which means Johannes Rex, which means the king. So he didn't sign it that he was the king. He just put a short name for John, which is Jack. He wrote Jack at the bottom of his letter. And then he puts a long list of things that he would like for Christmas, including an India rubber ball, a big red one. And so it's Christmas, and we're talking about King John having hopes and fears, but that his biggest fear was that he wouldn't get a Christmas present, and he hadn't had one for a very, very long time, for years and years. And so at Christmas, when the minstrels, the people who sing songs, were standing about and were getting money from people because of their singing, he would go away and ignore all the happiness of Christmas, but just hang out one stocking. And it says he hung a hopeful stocking out because he was hoping that he might get a present. So King John left the roof. It says gad him to his room, which means went to his room, descending by the spout, which means going through the chimney. And then he lay awake all night and he started to worry and wonder about whether he'd been good enough to get the presents. And he started to say that actually he didn't really want the presents and he didn't mind not having a present. And he goes through the list of things. Does he really want them? Does he not want them? and he decides in the end that really, if he's going to have a present, he really would like the big Indian red rubber ball, and he's not too worried about anything else. So the next day was Christmas Day, and the poem talks about the sun coming up to tell everybody it was Christmas, and everybody jumping out of bed to get their presents, and King John jumping out of bed and finding that in his stocking there is no present. And King John is very disappointed, and he goes back through his list about all the things that he would have wanted and how really he did want them. And then at the very end, he's so sad, and he says that if Santa had loved him at all, he would have given him a big red India rubber ball. And then the poem finishes with a happy ending, with King John, well, a happy ending for King John, looking out the window and watching the children play, and suddenly a ball comes flying through the window, hurtling, it says, past his head and landing on the bed, hence the rhyme. And Prince John is very happy, and he's got his ball, although the story doesn't mention whether or not he's got the ball by accident or he's got the ball because Father Christmas intended him to have it all along. Does he deserve the ball? Does everybody deserve a present? King John's Christmas, here we go, by A. Milne. King John was not a good man. He had his little ways, and sometimes no one spoke to him for days and days and days. And men who came across him when walking in the town gave him a supercilious air, or passed with noses in the air. And bad King John stood dumbly there, beneath his blushing crown. King John was not a good man, and no good friends had he. He stayed in every afternoon, but no one came to tea. And round about December, the cards upon his shelf, which wished him lots of Christmas cheer and fortune for the coming year, were never from his near and dear, but always from himself. As you know, King John was not a good man, yet had his hopes and fears. They'd given him no present now for years and years and years. But every year at Christmas, while minstrels stood about, collecting tribute for the young for all the songs they might have sung, he stole away upstairs and hung a hopeful stocking out. King John was not a good man. He lived his life aloof. Alone he thought a message out while climbing on the roof. He wrote it down and popped it against the chimney stack. To all and sundry, near and far, F. Christmas in particular, and signed it not Johannes R., but very humbly Jack. I want some crackers, and I want some candy, and I think a box of chocolates would come in handy. I do like oranges, I don't mind nuts, and I should like a pocket knife that really cuts. And, oh, Father Christmas, if you love me at all, bring me a big red India rubber ball. King John was not a good man. Next morning, when the sun rose up to tell the waiting world that Christmas had begun, and people seized their stockings and opened them with glee, and crackers, toys and games appeared, and lips with sticky sweets were smeared, King John said grimly, as I feared, nothing again for me. So the next day was Christmas Day, and the poem talks about the sun coming up to tell everybody it was Christmas, and everybody jumping out of bed to get their presents, and King John jumping out of bed and finding that in his stocking there is no present. I did want crackers and I did want candy, and I know a box of chocolates would have come in handy. I do love oranges, I did want nuts, and I haven't got a pocket knife, not one that cuts. And oh, Father Christmas, had you loved me at all, he would have bought me a big red India rubber ball. King John stood by the window and frowned to see below the happy bands of boys and girls all playing in the snow. And while he stood there watching and envying them all, then Through the window, big and red, there hurtled by his royal head, and bounced and fell upon the bed a big red India rubber ball. And oh, Father Christmas, my blessing on you fall, for bringing him a big red India rubber ball. So I think I love that poem because it's a bit silly, that if you were king and you could have anything you wanted in all the world and the only thing you wanted from Santa was a ball, doesn't really make sense, to be honest. But he got the present that he wanted and everybody was very happy. And all that's left now is for me to say to you, Merry Christmas.